Today we're talking about outlining, so I should probably preface all of this by telling you I have no idea what I'm doing. Hey team, happy Monday and welcome back to Building a Book, a 12-part series chronicling my process of getting a book out into the world. This is week 2, and this week we are talking about outlining a book, which is something I have been studying a lot in the last year or so because I am a reformed pantser of sorts. I always try to outline books and then I just kind of give up halfway and start writing and regret it later on. So for now, I am trying to outline my books moving forward because at least for me, I do think it offers me a little more in terms of fleshing out my plots and my characters and having cleaner first drafts so I don't have to edit quite so much later, which is definitely a win for me. So if this is not your style, feel free to ignore all of this. Go forth and pants your books like nobody's business. For me, I am trying to outline more and plot more, and this is what I did for this particular book. I may change this process a little going forward and just kind of evolve it over time, but for now this is the first book I actually plotted from beginning to end before writing the book, and I'm pretty happy with how things are turning out. So for me, pretty consistently with my books, whether it's the first one I ever wrote all the way to this one, I don't really start writing a book until I have a pretty clear idea of the beginning, middle, and end. I never really write anything down, but I do let the story evolve in my head over time, sometimes over the course of years, before I feel like I have a strong enough handle on it to actually jump in. I have been trying to write this sci-fi book in different versions for pretty much years, so I had a lot of different pieces, and though very little of the original first 2, I think, drafts of the book ended up in this final outline, it did give me a pretty solid jumping off point. So phase 1 for me and this outline was to write down everything I already had that I knew I still wanted to use in this version of the book in terms of plot points. So I put them down in order, what I thought would happen first, all the way to what would happen at the end. This left me with kind of 10 to 15 beats that didn't really make sense at all. I did not have a cohesive story in any sense of the word, but I did have kind of an idea of where I was headed, and that brought me to phase 2. So for me, phase 2 was really fleshing out what I had already, starting at the first plot point, which was kind of that first scene, and then what did I need to get me to the next plot point, and sometimes that was a lot of different things that had to happen to get me from point 1 to what ended up being chapter 4 to what ended up being chapter 15, so I just kind of went through and grew my story over time. At this stage, I wasn't worrying about chapters or point of view or anything like that, just what was happening to my characters, where was the bad guy, what was happening in terms of major tension moments, and just wrote it all down. I ended up scratching a lot of these different ideas and taking them out completely or moving them around, but really I was just writing down all of the things that would happen in this book. I kept going like this until I conceivably had enough plot points to get me to an 80,000 or so word book. Then for phase 3, I kind of broke it down into what would make sense for different chapters. So which scenes went together and would make sense having the same point of view character, where did I go on too long before I needed to jump to somebody else, or the pacing was starting to slow and I really needed to just cut a chunk, and really I started at chapter 1, figured out what that chapter would be, who the point of view character would be, and if I had enough content to fill that chapter or too much, and then went on to chapter 2 and just kept going all the way to chapter 31. It's now 30 chapters, but that was pretty much my process. In terms of the point of views I wanted to use, I wanted kind of an even shift between the main female character and the main male character, plus one point of view chapter for all of the other crew members on board this starship, so I kind of got a sense of every different character through the course of the book, but the plot really focused in on 2 main people. So this meant I had to go back into my outline and kind of rework different things, and then I went in and actually grew these characters. I don't usually start with characters, even though that's something I do want to do a little more of in the future. I wrote down everything I knew about these characters, kind of grew their backgrounds a little, and then I went right back to chapter 1 and kind of started again, fleshing out each chapter, changing things so that it made more sense with what the characters would actually do and their motivations and all of that fun stuff, adding in a couple of subplots with different character relationships, and making sure no one character was being neglected over the entirety of the story arc. After all of that was finished, I ended up with an outline that was about 3,000 words. Each one of the 30 chapters had at least 8 plot points, and sometimes there was a bunch of other stuff that I didn't write down, but I kind of knew when this happens, this was the reasons that it was happening, this is what it was going to lead to later on. So a lot of it was on paper, but a bunch of it was still in my head, and a lot of that stuff has kind of changed over time as I've actually been writing the book, but we're going to talk about that a little bit later. When it's come to writing the book, the thing that's been nice about this particular outline is that I didn't go too far into detail, so there's still a little bit of wiggle room to play around with the characters and what's going on, and even some of the plot points as I went through and actually wrote the book. Pretty much every single chapter still had something that surprised me, which kept it interesting as I was going through and working through the various plot points that I already knew it was going to happen, but seeing it kind of get fleshed out as I wrote the actual chapter was really cool. So for you guys, if you're dead set against outlining, at the very least, I would recommend kind of knowing the beginning of your book, where you want to end up, have a sense of your characters, and maybe know a few of the scenes that you want to happen in the middle and how they affect getting to that end point. If you do want to experiment a little bit more with outlining, then knowing kind of at least 1 or 2 beats of what happens in each chapter can be really, really helpful. And of course, I am sure that so many of you guys know way more about outlining than I do, so if you have any advice, let me know in the comments, and I will absolutely check that out. And I'm sure if I ever do another building a book video in the future, my outlining process is going to be completely different from this. I hope to grow it over time and come up with something that's really useful to me as a writer and helps me really focus in on the story I want to tell. Or who knows, maybe I'll throw all of this out the window for my next book, just writing whatever comes to mind as I want to write it. But I hope not, because I really do think outlining is going to help me as a writer, and I'm going to try to give it a shot for at least a few books and see if it's something I can grow into feeling more comfortable with. But that's it for me today. I'll be back next week to talk about my process of actually writing this book, because hopefully by that point my second draft will actually be finished and kind of off to different editors and beta readers and all of that fun stuff. So in the meantime, I have some work to do, but for now, happy reading, happy writing, and I'll see you next time.